Every morning at 7:42 a.m., a yellow school bus would pull up to the corner of Maple Street in suburban New Jersey, and among the sleepy-eyed teenagers climbing aboard was a kid who would one day orchestrate one of the most audacious financial frauds in American history. His name was Michael Chen, and in 2008, he was just another 16-year-old with a backpack full of textbooks and a head full of numbers. But while his classmates were cramming for algebra tests, Michael was teaching himself something far more valuable: how money actually moves through the American banking system. He discovered online forums where traders discussed securities, derivatives, and the arcane mechanisms of Wall Street, and he consumed it all with the intensity of someone who'd found a treasure map. His parents thought he was doing homework. They had no idea their son was reverse engineering the financial world from his bedroom in a middle-class neighborhood where the biggest crime was usually a stolen bicycle. The thing about Michael was that he understood something most adults never grasp: the financial system runs on trust, and trust is just a series of assumptions that nobody bothers to verify. He'd read about Bernie Madoff, about Enron, about all the frauds that had come before, and he'd noticed a pattern. They all started small. They all exploited gaps in oversight. And they all relied on one simple truth: people believe what they want to believe, especially when there's money involved. By his senior year, Michael had stopped paying attention in class entirely. He'd sit in the back of AP Calculus, his textbook open to the correct page, while his phone, hidden in his lap, displayed real-time market data and trading forums. His teachers thought he was distracted. They had no idea he was planning. 3 months after graduation, Michael enrolled at Rutgers with a declared major in finance, but he rarely attended lectures. Instead, he spent 18 hours a day in his dorm room, building something. He'd noticed that small community banks, the kind that served rural towns and aging populations, had outdated security systems and overwhelmed compliance departments. They were required by law to verify the identity of people opening accounts, but the verification process was largely automated, outsourced to third-party services that ran basic checks against databases that were often years out of date. Michael created fake identities, not by stealing real people's information, but by generating synthetic identities, combinations of real social security numbers with fake names and addresses that technically passed automated verification but corresponded to no actual person. It was a ghost army of financial entities, and he controlled every single one. The first account he opened was at a bank in Pennsylvania, an institution so small it had only 3 branches and a website that looked like it hadn't been updated since 2003. He deposited $500 using a money order, let the account sit dormant for 6 weeks to establish legitimacy, then began moving money. Not much at first. Just small transfers between his synthetic accounts, building transaction histories that would make them appear normal to any automated fraud detection system. He was 19 years old, living on ramen noodles and energy drinks, and he was learning how to become invisible inside the very system designed to track every dollar. The banks never noticed because there was nothing to notice. No flags were raised. No alarms sounded. He was a phantom operating in the gaps between attention and oversight. By the time Michael turned 20, he had 127 synthetic identities and accounts at 43 different banks across 17 states. But having accounts wasn't enough. He needed a product, something to sell, something that would make people want to give him their money. That's when he discovered the world of private investment funds. These weren't the giant hedge funds you read about in the Wall Street Journal. These were small, barely regulated investment vehicles that wealthy individuals used to park money in alternative assets. The Securities and Exchange Commission technically had jurisdiction, but they were overwhelmed, underfunded, and focused on bigger fish. Michael registered a company called Meridian Capital Ventures in Delaware, a state famous for its business-friendly laws and minimal disclosure requirements. He listed himself as managing director under one of his synthetic identities, created a professional website full of stock photos and vague language about algorithmic trading strategies and quantitative analysis, and waited. The first investor was a dentist from Ohio who'd made a small fortune in real estate and was looking for higher returns than his broker could provide. He found Meridian through a targeted ad campaign Michael had launched, clicked through the professional-looking website, filled out an inquiry form, and received a phone call from Marcus Wellington, one of Michael's aliases, delivered through a voice modulation app that made him sound 15 years older. The dentist asked reasonable questions. Marcus had convincing answers, all lifted from legitimate investment prospectuses and repackaged with enough technical jargon to sound sophisticated. The dentist invested $50,000. Michael sent him a beautifully designed quarterly statement showing an 8% return. The dentist was thrilled. He told his golf buddies. 3 of them invested. Michael sent them all statements showing modest but consistent gains. None of it was real. There were no trades, no algorithms, no investments. The money just moved between Michael's network of accounts, creating the illusion of financial activity while he siphoned off portions for himself. What Michael understood, what made him different from every amateur fraudster who'd come before, was restraint. He didn't buy a Ferrari. He didn't rent a penthouse. He lived in a modest apartment, drove a used Honda, and dressed like every other 20-something in the tri-state area. He paid his taxes, filing returns that showed moderate income from consulting work. He was methodical, patient, and terrifyingly smart about the psychology of greed. His fake returns were never spectacular, 8 to 12% annually, just enough to beat the market without triggering suspicion. His investors weren't widows and orphans, they were dentists, small business owners, mid-level executives, people who had money but not enough to access the truly exclusive investment opportunities reserved for the ultra-wealthy. They wanted to feel smart, to feel like they'd discovered something special. Michael gave them that feeling, and they gave him their money. By 2013, Meridian Capital Ventures was managing, or claiming to manage, $87 million from 312 investors. Michael had expanded beyond individual investors to include small family trusts and even a few pension funds from rural municipalities whose investment committees were unpaid volunteers with no financial expertise. He'd hired a small staff, paying them salaries to maintain the illusion of a legitimate operation, though none of them knew the firm was entirely fraudulent. They processed paperwork, answered phones, sent out statements, all while believing they worked for a successful boutique investment fund. Michael had created a reality distortion field so convincing that even the people inside it couldn't see the truth. His quarterly investor calls featured discussions of market volatility and portfolio rebalancing that sounded like they came straight from CNBC. Investors would hang up feeling informed and confident. Some of them increased their investments. The first crack appeared in March 2015, when an investor named Richard Hawthorne requested a full redemption of his account, not because he suspected fraud, but because his daughter needed money for medical expenses. Michael had always kept enough liquid cash to handle small redemptions, but Hawthorne's account was worth $3.2 million, one of the largest in the fund. Michael stalled, citing lock-up periods and market conditions, but Hawthorne was insistent. His daughter's health was deteriorating. He needed the money now. Michael had a choice: disappear with what he'd already stolen, or double down. He doubled down. He launched a second fund, Meridian Growth Partners, with a minimum investment of $1 million and marketing materials promising access to pre-IPO technology investments and exclusive opportunities in emerging markets. It was the same fraud with a fresh coat of paint. But it worked. New money poured in, $63 million in the first 8 months, and Michael used it to pay off Hawthorne and a handful of other investors who'd requested redemptions. It's called a Ponzi scheme, though Michael preferred to think of it as liquidity management. By 2017, the combined assets under management across his various funds exceeded $500 million. Michael was 26 years old. He'd moved into a townhouse in Manhattan, though he made sure it was nice but not ostentatious, the kind of place a successful young fund manager might realistically afford. He dated occasionally but never seriously. Relationships required honesty, and honesty was a luxury he couldn't afford. He'd also started having panic attacks, episodes where his chest would tighten and his vision would narrow and he'd have to lock himself in a bathroom and focus on breathing until the terror passed. Because here's what nobody tells you about running a billion-dollar fraud. It never gets easier. Every day you wake up knowing that hundreds of people trust you with their money, their futures, their children's college funds, and every dollar of it is built on a foundation of lies that could collapse at any moment. Michael had created a machine that required constant feeding, and if he ever stopped, if the money ever stopped flowing in, the entire structure would implode. The second fund's success allowed him to expand into international markets, or at least to claim he had. Meridian Global Opportunities launched in 2018 with a focus on emerging Asian markets and Pan-African infrastructure development. The paperwork listed offices in Singapore and Johannesburg, complete with local phone numbers that forwarded to call centers Michael had contracted, where operators would answer questions using scripts he'd written. Investors who called to check on their African infrastructure investments would hear professional voices discussing port developments and telecommunications projects that existed only in Michael's imagination. It was theater on a global scale, and it was remarkably effective. High-net-worth individuals who'd made their money in traditional industries loved the idea of getting in early on the next economic frontier. They wired money to accounts in the Cayman Islands, in Luxembourg, in Singapore, and Michael shuffled it all through his network, paying old investors with new money, keeping the machinery running. But the machine was hungry, and it was getting hungrier. By mid-2019, Michael needed to raise approximately $12 million per month just to cover the fake returns he was sending to existing investors. He'd also started skimming more aggressively, transferring money to cryptocurrency accounts and offshore holdings that even he was starting to lose track of. His panic attacks had become a weekly occurrence. In October 2019, Michael launched his most ambitious product yet, the Meridian Crypto Ventures Fund. Cryptocurrency was having a moment, and Michael recognized that the lack of regulation and the complexity of the technology meant he could make even more outrageous claims with even less scrutiny. He promised investors exposure to early-stage blockchain protocols and tokenized real estate and DeFi yield strategies that sounded cutting-edge and sophisticated. The minimum investment was $500,000. Within 6 months, the fund had raised $340 million. Michael had tapped into something primal in the psychology of wealthy investors, the fear of missing out. They'd watched Bitcoin go from pennies to tens of thousands of dollars, and they were terrified of being left behind again. Michael offered them a chance to be early adopters, to be visionaries, and they gave him their money without asking too many questions because they wanted it to be true. The FBI had actually been aware of Meridian Capital for almost 2 years, but not because they suspected fraud. In 2017, one of Michael's synthetic identities had been flagged during a routine check by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, a Treasury Department agency that monitors money laundering. The flag wasn't for the fraud itself but for an unusual pattern of international wire transfers that resembled known money laundering schemes. An agent named Sarah Kozlov was assigned to investigate, and what she found initially seemed legitimate: a licensed investment fund with proper registration, public filings, and an office in Manhattan. She'd even called the office and spoken to one of Michael's employees, who'd cheerfully explained the firm's investment strategy. Kozlov had closed the file, noting that while the transfer patterns were unusual, they appeared consistent with international investment activity. She'd moved on to other cases. It was a near miss that Michael never even knew about. But Kozlov had kept a bookmark in her browser, a reminder to check back on Meridian if anything else came up. And in January 2020, something did. A financial analyst at a competing fund had noticed something odd. Meridian Capital claimed to have made several significant investments in pre-IPO technology companies, but when she'd reached out to those companies to discuss potential co-investment opportunities, none of them had any record of Meridian as an investor. She'd mentioned this to a friend who worked at the SEC, who'd passed it along to a colleague, who'd eventually sent an informal inquiry to Kozlov at the FBI. It wasn't an official investigation yet, just a question: had anyone looked into these guys? Kozlov pulled up her old file, saw her notes from 2017, and decided to dig a little deeper. What she found over the next 3 weeks was a masterclass in financial smoke and mirrors. The investments Meridian claimed to have made didn't exist. The returns they were showing investors were mathematically impossible given the market conditions. And when she started tracing the money through the banking system, she found a web of accounts that didn't make sense unless someone was deliberately trying to obscure the flow of funds. It wasn't an official investigation yet, just a question: had anyone looked into these guys? Kozlov pulled up her old file, saw her notes from 2017, and decided to dig a little deeper. What she found over the next 3 weeks was a master class in financial smoke and mirrors. The investments Meridian claimed to have made didn't exist. The returns they were showing investors were mathematically impossible given the market conditions. And when she started tracing the money through the banking system, she found a web of accounts that didn't make sense unless someone was deliberately trying to obscure the flow of funds. Michael found out about the investigation on March 2 when 2 FBI agents showed up at his office asking to speak with him. He'd been in a meeting with potential investors, walking them through a presentation about blockchain integration in supply chain management, and his assistant had interrupted to say there were federal agents in the lobby. For exactly 3 seconds, Michael considered running. He had go bags packed, fake passports, cryptocurrency wallets with access codes, an entire escape plan he'd developed during one of his panic attacks at 2 in the morning. But he also knew that running would mean living the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, and he was so tired. He told the investors something had come up, apologized for cutting the meeting short, and walked out to meet the agents. They asked if he'd be willing to come to their office to answer some questions. He said yes. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't ask what it was about. He just grabbed his coat and followed them out the door, leaving behind an office full of employees who had no idea their jobs were about to disappear. The interview room at the FBI's New York field office was smaller than Michael had expected, with scuffed walls and fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly sickly. Agent Kozlov sat across from him with a folder full of documents, and she started with simple questions. How long had Meridian been in operation? What was the fund's investment strategy? Could he provide documentation of the firm's holdings? Michael answered honestly at first, describing the funds and their supposed strategies, but Kozlov kept pushing, asking for specifics, for account numbers, for proof of trades. And then she opened the folder and slid a document across the table. It was a flowchart, a visual representation of money moving through his network of accounts, and Michael realized they knew. They knew everything. The synthetic identities, the fake offices, the Ponzi structure, all of it. He could have maintained the lie. He could have demanded a lawyer and fought it for years. Instead, he put his head in his hands and said, "I need to tell you how this works." Over the next 11 hours, Michael Chen walked federal investigators through the entire scheme, from the first synthetic identity he'd created in his dorm room to the $1 billion in fake assets he was managing when the FBI came knocking. He explained the technical details of how he'd fooled the banks, the psychological techniques he'd used to keep investors confident, the cascade of new funds he'd created to keep the money flowing. He showed them spreadsheets tracking the real numbers versus the fake returns, documents outlining his offshore accounts, everything. The agents kept expecting him to lawyer up and stop talking, but he didn't. He seemed almost relieved to finally tell someone the truth. By the time they were done, it was past midnight, and Michael Chen had handed them one of the most detailed confessions in the history of financial fraud. The numbers were staggering. $1.3 billion in claimed assets under management. 2,847 individual investors, ranging from retired teachers with their life savings in the fund to wealthy executives with millions at stake. The fraud had touched every state and 17 countries. Some investors had been with Meridian since the beginning, watching their statements show steady growth for nearly a decade, never knowing it was all fiction. When the FBI began notifying victims in March 2020, the reactions ranged from disbelief to fury to devastating grief. A retired couple in Florida had invested their entire retirement account, $680,000, based on years of consistent statements. A teacher in Oregon had put her inheritance from her parents into the fund, convinced she was securing her children's future. A small town in Wisconsin had invested part of its municipal pension fund, and the loss would impact the retirement security of every police officer, firefighter, and public employee in the town. These weren't abstract numbers. They were lives, futures, dreams, all built on a foundation that a kid from New Jersey had constructed out of lies and spreadsheets. Michael Chen was arrested on March 6, 2020, and charged with wire fraud, securities fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The maximum sentence was 150 years. He posted bail using cryptocurrency assets the FBI hadn't yet frozen and went back to his townhouse to wait for trial. For 3 months, he barely left the apartment, watching news coverage of the scandal and reading articles analyzing how the fraud had gone undetected for so long. Financial experts called it one of the most sophisticated schemes since Madoff. Regulators scrambled to explain how someone so young had exploited so many gaps in the system. Investors filed lawsuits, though there was barely any money left to recover. And public employee in the town. These weren't abstract numbers. They were lives, futures, dreams, all built on a foundation that a kid from New Jersey had constructed out of lies and spreadsheets. Michael Chen was arrested on March 6, 2020, and charged with wire fraud, securities fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The maximum sentence was 150 years. He posted bail using cryptocurrency assets the FBI hadn't yet frozen and went back to his townhouse to wait for trial. For 3 months, he barely left the apartment, watching news coverage of the scandal and reading articles analyzing how the fraud had gone undetected for so long. Financial experts called it one of the most sophisticated schemes since Madoff. Regulators scrambled to explain how someone so young had exploited so many gaps in the system. Investors filed lawsuits, though there was barely any money left to recover. He didn't try to justify what he'd done or minimize the harm. He explained, in technical detail, how he'd exploited the system, and he answered every question with a flat honesty that seemed almost disconnected from the magnitude of the destruction he'd caused. When asked why he'd done it, he said he didn't have a good answer. It had started as an intellectual challenge, proving to himself that he could beat the system, and by the time he realized the human cost, he was too deep to stop. The jury deliberated for 7 hours and found him guilty on all counts. At sentencing in February 2021, the judge called it one of the most egregious frauds she'd seen in 30 years on the bench. Victim after victim gave impact statements, describing marriages that had collapsed under financial stress, retirements that had been destroyed, children who couldn't afford college, medical treatments that had been postponed or cancelled. The aftermath of the fraud rippled outward for years. The SEC implemented new verification requirements for investment funds. Banks upgraded their identity verification systems to catch synthetic identities. Several small financial institutions that had been used in the scheme faced regulatory penalties for inadequate oversight. But the deepest impact was on the victims themselves, people who trusted their money to someone who'd seemed so professional, so competent, so convincing. Some of them recovered a portion of their investments through a bankruptcy process that stretched on for years. Many recovered nothing. They'd trusted the statements, trusted the quarterly calls, trusted the professional website and the Manhattan office and the regulated financial system to protect them. And a kid who'd started teaching himself finance while riding a school bus in New Jersey had proven that trust, in the end, was just another vulnerability waiting to be exploited. Michael Chen currently resides at FCI Cumberland, a medium-security federal prison in Maryland. He works in the prison library and has taken correspondence courses in mathematics and computer science, though he's barred from accessing the internet. In rare interviews with journalists, he's described the fraud with the same clinical precision he showed at trial, explaining the mechanisms and the psychology with the detachment of someone analyzing a system he's no longer part of. He's expressed remorse, though victims say the apologies ring hollow when delivered from someone who'll spend the rest of his life behind bars while they struggle with the financial consequences of his choices. The FBI recovered approximately $93 million in assets, less than 10% of what was lost. The rest had simply vanished into the machinery of the fraud, consumed by the need to keep up the illusion month after month, year after year, until the entire structure finally collapsed under.